The human being is by nature a creative structure, and in all of his aspects, mental, psychical, emotional, and physical, he finds the greatest possible integration of his own personality through the development of creative outlets for the psychic life that is locked within him. When we block these outlets or fail to develop them, we destroy part of the energy circulation of man's nature. That which does not flow is not subject to its natural tides and motions, has a tendency to become foul or to be polluted like stagnant water. Where we ignore man's natural creativity over a long period of time, we certainly also destroy certain instincts or impulses toward creative self-expression. We develop a kind of psychic laziness. And today, we apologize for this, but do nothing about it. Instead of developing some adequate creativity to give pleasure to our lives, we depend more and more upon the creative talents of other people. We are satisfied to sit down in front of a television and watch the hard-labored works of others. Sometimes we are a little disappointed because the programs lack creativity. But this is natural, where you have a standardized product, where you have a highly economic factor to consider. In our entertainment world, there is a great deal of creativity that we will never know anything about, because it cannot be economized. It cannot be fitted into the pattern of our present theory of values. If, however, we do have the time and leisure to devote to such highly artificial entertainment, we also have some time to consider the release of our own creative power. And throughout history, we realize that the rise of peoples, particularly masses of peoples, this rise is always accompanied by a development of arts. And those arts which arise from highly technical schools, we now refer to as fine arts. Those which come as the spontaneous expression of the natural instinct of people, we refer to as folk arts. I was reading not long ago a rather interesting little essay which pointed out that up to about 100 years ago, our dictionaries had no term to distinguish an artist from an artisan. The two words had identically the same meaning. All artists of older times were artisans, for they actually worked. They labored at their various activities. The great silversmith, the wonderful tapestry weaver, these persons were artisans, yet the products of their skill we now call fine art. Technically, fine art depends upon training. It depends upon certain exceptional aptitudes, highly skilled through instruction. And art of this kind is comparatively rare in any culture. Especially it is rare in a culture which offers no inducements for the production of it. And one of the reasons why so many of our arts are in decrepitude at this time is because there is not sufficient popular appreciation. Folk art, on the other hand, cuts through most of the severities of art discipline. Today in the West, we are beginning to appreciate folk artistry. Museums have been created, a department set aside in galleries, and funds have been established for the encouragement of native artistry, artistry arising from the spontaneous expression of the psychic life of man. Actually, if we want to be technical enough, we can say that in real usage, artist and artisan are still words with approximately the same meaning. All fine art that we know has arisen from folk art, and the artistic wealth of a people is often drawn upon by fine artists for the production of special, highly technical works. For instance, a number of the composers of the 19th century, whose symphonies and operas, sonatas we admire, actually derived their themes from the folk music of their people or other peoples. Thus, in the hands of a great composer, a folk theme may be developed into a magnificent symphony. It all requires only the adaptation of the available material. Music is especially interesting in this area because every culture of importance has developed its folk music. Folk dance is another phase of the same situation. And folk ceramics, wood carvings, and things of this nature all bear witness to the spontaneous creativity of peoples. Why has this situation, for the most part, disintegrated? Why have we no longer the instinct for this type of thing? Even in our own country, we did some rather good work. New England, New York State produced some fine folk art in old days. And when men went to the sea in ships of wood, the figureheads of ships were usually extraordinary examples of untrained genius. We regard them today as perhaps not the highest form of art, but collections of these are now being made by very serious students who are interested not so much in accumulating a lot of roughly carved timber as they are in the aesthetic instincts behind this particular expression of natural genius. We can't recommend that the average apartment dweller collect cigar store Indians, for example. These are rather too large for convenience, nearly life-size, but not so long ago these were standing in the fronts of nearly all tobacconists throughout the country. These figures gave inspiration to the local carpenter and to persons who would never have dared to consider themselves as artists. But they were able to make very interesting, curious, and sometimes rather excellent sculpturings of the primitive red man, usually represented holding out a bundle of cigars. This was folk art, but it did give creativity to people. Other types of folk art which we have noted in this country includes embroidery of various kinds, and some very interesting examples of old samplers and the like ornament museums and galleries today. At county fairs it is still not too uncommon to find elaborate counterpanes beautifully made out of small fabric fragments put together in remarkable patterns, and first prizes are still awarded for this industry. Actually, peoples created because they felt the need. And in times when life was rather severe, religion was rather dull, there was great need for some form of self-expression. And this was as true in the farm, the small town, as in any other area of the country. We wonder then why all of this gradually faded out of our common experience, so that today, as far as creativity is concerned, the average person is almost helpless. He finds it very difficult to arrange a handful of flowers in a vase successfully. He finds it very difficult to do simple things to ornament his own home or his own environment. And if he is a person of means, he will almost certainly call in an experienced decorator to do his creativity for him. This situation contributes in some degree at least to the prevailing neurosis. We are simply people without expression. And there's the old saying that the devil will always find work for idle hands to do, and the hands of people have a tendency to be idle so far as creativity is concerned. We are more inclined to simply sit and look at something. Out of this, we do know that something is disappearing that is valuable to us. Art is a great social force. People interested in various artistic activities develop better social outlets. It would be very difficult to conceive of an important group of artists hanging over a local bar. They are doing something else. They are not only doing something better, but their artistry will not cost them near as much as their alcohol. So there is even economy, and good art is generally best attained in a condition of sobriety. This need for art brings us a little closer to a great many factors that are useful at this time in our thinking. If you have traveled about, you have observed the natural skill of untrained people. We find this natural skill in the old houses that were built in this country long before professional architects were thought of. These houses were put together by the ingenuity of the community. Someone had a plan, perhaps sketched on a piece of paper, or perhaps it sort of developed as the structure enlarged. Many of these old houses are still showplaces, not only because of the beauty of their workmanship, but of the grand design. And today, skillful architects go and study these places. And I know one prominent New York architect who felt tremendously enamored of a certain house built by a farmer in upstate New York 150 years ago, and could not rest until he had purchased it. It was a kind of situation in which a very skillful architect paid tribute to a house which had no architect, simply because the total effect was good. It had been developed by some kind of sheer genius within the soul of a farmer and his family. Thus these expressions do live on and do contribute richly to our culture. We are now producing some folk artists, but they are more or less semi-professionals. A good example of this was dear old Grandma Moses. No one will ever say that she was another Leonardo, but she undoubtedly had a very pleasant period in her life at a time when most individuals consider themselves to be useless or entirely decadent. Instead of admitting this uselessness of age, she simply went to work and did things that pleased her. And because they pleased her, they ultimately pleased other people. And with a little promotion, which she undoubtedly had, she became quite a figure in the amateur arts of this country. Folk art, of course, differs from fine art in another important point in terms of culture. Most folk art is not produced for profit. The folk artist had no real belief that he was creating art. For the most part, he considered himself creating utilities. The things that he made because he needed them or wanted them. Perhaps because they were not easily available elsewhere, or he could not afford to buy them. Thus our rising industrial life, providing us with greater means, enables us to buy what we want. And in this process of substituting buying for creating, we have lost a great deal of ground psychologically. There are many streams that flow together to constitute a line of psychological integration. And we know that this situation is poor in our country. We know that we are becoming more and more neurotic and psychotic. We like to blame this entirely upon a few large international factors. But the truth still remains that people have always worked under difficulties. The men who built the early homes in this country not only were creating a new land here, but they applied their architectural trade with their tools in their hands and their old rifles lying beside them to protect themselves against Indian raids. None of these things were accomplished in great ease or in a state of complete security. They were accomplished because people wanted to accomplish them. And regardless of other pressures upon their lives, they went on and did the things that they believed were important. So today we have some very fine, primitive American antiques built up during this period of ingenuity. Most of these antiques were worthless immediately after they were fashioned, and maybe for years afterwards. But many of them today are considered as priceless. We all probably remember the days when we bought the little wrought iron banks with various mechanical toys associated with them. They were 39 cents or 69 cents, and they were made in some little factory which was still essentially a folk art factory. Today these same banks, if you can buy them, are $50 or $100 apiece. And it has now reached a point where they are reproduced in worthy facsimile. These things were the toys of our ancestors. Today they are art. They represent a creativity in our people. Sometimes it was a little funny. Sometimes the creativity was mostly eccentricity. But still, people did something themselves. They tried to meet the needs of their own psychic lives. Of course, in our Southwest, we had the Spanish-American communities with their folk arts. And we know that most of the primitive tribes that occupied this continent also had their own artistry, and that among the more civilized tribes it was also approaching a grand art concept. The marvelous frescoes on the walls of Bonampak in Central America are among the finest examples of mural decoration in the world, yet they were the product of a comparatively primitive people. So creativity is an instinct in us until something dulls that instinct, takes it away from us, and causes us to forget that we are here not only to make a living, but to express ourselves, and to express ourselves in some way more commendable than argument or dissension or petty fault-finding. Now this brings us very largely to the problem of the moment. How are we going to bring artistry back into our own lives. If we are thoughtful people, we will realize that most artistry that might be suitable to us would not be necessarily an extravagance. It isn't necessary for us, in order to do some simple thing, to move in $5,000 or $10,000 worth of elaborate equipment. Our ancestors had no such equipment. The most wonderful primitive carvings that were done in this country were done with a mallet, a chisel, and a jackknife. And we still greatly admire these products. But today, if we want to build anything not any more complicated than a pair of bookends, we practically have to buy all equipment known to man. What we are really looking for is a machine that will automatically make the bookends without our even touching it. This would be our idea of artistic maturity. Actually, also, by all this equipment, we lose the spontaneous sense that comes with good natural art. And we produce, by mass procedure, an abundance of anything that we do make. One individual who bought quite a fine group of instruments, tools, lathes, created quite an industry in his own backyard, ended up with so many bookends that he couldn't even give them away. He was making bookends by the hundred, until finally the whole idea sort of paled on him. He sold off his equipment and went into photography. This is the way it goes these days. I have a friend who is probably one of the outstanding photographers in this country. He had wide experience. He has internationally exhibited. He has won many gold awards all over the world. And people going to him expect to find a man with a magnificent equipment. He has it. He has everything you can think of, but he keeps it under glass. And when he's going out to make a picture which he hopes will win an international award, he works with a box Kodak and wins. All of this equipment could never take the place of the fact that this man is an artist. His artistry is inside of himself. The camera is incidental. He is not worried about all of the gadgets and gimmicks which now are regarded as necessary and make every hobby and avocation so frightfully expensive that for most persons it is a major disaster in life. In the same thinking, throughout all of our creativity, there is need for some legitimate reason for what we are doing. The average person has very little inclination just to make things and throw them away. We would like to believe that whatever we create has some reason for its own existence. And this problem brings us rather close to another serious situation in our way of living today. We have lost the need for almost everything. We can buy anything cheaper than we can make it. That is, in the majority of cases. Perhaps not really cheaper, but by the time we get the equipment together, definitely cheaper, due to the fact that we are also likely to discontinue our interest in the subject before the equipment is paid for. Lacking some reason for what we're doing, we have gradually created a different kind of taste, a taste that will never be understood by persons and nations that are still folk conscious. This is the belief that the machine-made product is more beautiful than the handmade product. It has almost become a disgrace now to let people know that anything you have, you made yourself. It would almost imply that you couldn't afford to buy it, and that would be a very poor status symbol at the present moment. We have no longer the sense of pride in the fact that a thing has been created by ourselves. We would rather prefer to think that it is one of a million of its kind, put out by some wholesale manufacturing company. If we are satisfied, therefore, to surround ourselves with these stock products, there is a boredom about it all. There is nothing that really creates any sense of pride, any sense of personal security, because we can produce things that we need. And in this way, folk art also plays a very important psychological role in our lives. It isn't important so long as we think of it only in competition to manufactured goods. I have another friend who is quite an expert in weaving. He is very much dedicated to hand-woven fabrics. Now he knows, and everyone else knows, that he is not saving any money, because in his particular hobby, the materials necessary for weaving are quite expensive. But after he has woven a piece of cloth successfully, he decides that he will have it made into a jacket or into something that he wants. And he wears this with peculiar pride, simply because he made it himself. That he had the skill to weave this material is important to him. Yet dozens of his friends have come and told him, "You do it so perfectly, we can't tell whether it's hand-done or not. We just saw some admirable fabric in a certain outlet shop at a bargain price. We couldn't tell yours from that fabric. And yet we know that you spent hundreds of hours weaving this piece of cloth. What is the reason for it? Why don't you just go out and buy this other very elegant material, originally $22 a yard, now a sellout at $7.98, and make yourself a jacket, or go down and buy a good one?" My friend has a sort of a pained expression on his face by the time this discussion is finished. He knows all these things. He knows them perfectly well. But he realizes what an important part this creativity has played in his own life. As he told me not long ago, he said, "I am a better adjusted person. I am a happier person. I am more content with life. I can carry a hard job better, simply because I have created this little world of creativity. And the products of it, whether anyone else knows this is hand-woven or not, I don't care. I do. And out of it, I have come to learn to appreciate the wonderful crafts work of all who have gone before me. I begin to look with greater interest on the textiles of the Incas, or the ancient fabrics of the Copts, or the old remnants that have come down to us of the weaving of Egypt, or Persia, or China. There is a new world of beauty that comes to the individual who really understands how much work there are in these things. How much work there is in these things. And also, you can never have this intimate experience unless you have done it yourself. You are now united to a band of craftsmen that have helped to make life beautiful for thousands of years. One country that has been rather consistent in maintaining its folk arts, of course, has been Japan. And there is this rather interesting point that I feel is worth mentioning. We may have mentioned it before, but it fits in well. Throughout Japan, along the country roads, there are little monuments inscribed, often with a little clay bowl in front of the stone tablet and some incense sticks stuck in the bowl. These monuments are created in memory of folk craftsmen. These craftsmen are not known by name. No one knows who they are. But these monuments are simply inscribed to these unknown creators who have helped to make the culture of the country rich and warm and mature. They were the farmers who so marvelously fashioned the thatched roofs of their houses. They were the people in small towns who painted and drew and carved and modeled their clay and did all kinds of things to produce simple utensils for common usage. Yet today, these utensils are priceless. They are preserved in the great museums of Asia, and as one other pointed out in an essay, when we dig up two little clay bowls from some mound in Korea, where mounds are not very plentiful and bowls of that period are very scarce, they bring fabulous prices if anyone wants to sell them. Yet the man who made them did not value them at all. He merely valued them, if at all, simply because they held water and because he could use them. Yet into them he put something, so that today masters of ceramic arts all over the world are trying to copy, usually without much success, the works of these old Korean farmers who were illiterate, who had no contact with the outside world, who probably did not have the slightest respect for fine art, but who did need bowls, so they made them. But into each of these bowls was put something of taste, something of the sense of rightness, of fitness, which resulted in a tremendous beauty, a beauty that we honor and revere today. Thus, through creativity, we release beauty, and beauty is therapy for nearly all the problems that burden us now. So there are ways in which each person can begin to think about the possibility of gaining release for some phase of his own soul. The soul in man is locked pretty tightly within his corporeal constitution these days. There are very few things that bring out from him any great amount of appreciation. He does not become overwhelmed when he visits a great museum and sees a pageantry of art. He appreciates it, but for the most part he does not really have enough conscious artistry in himself to know the meaning of what he is seeing. He does not value the social force of art. He does not recognize that it bears witness to the rising and maturing of civilizations. To him it is simply an archaic fragment, something belonging to the past. His first question is probably going to be, how much is it worth? If it's very expensive, he looks twice. If it is not very expensive, he only looks once. The meaning of the thing itself eludes him, because he has no grounded expression of creativity in his own consciousness. So we need to do something about this type of thing if we want to save the money that we are now spending on doctors' bills and psychologists. We also need to do something about it if we want to keep our homes together and want to reduce the delinquency of our children. Art, creativity, these things bind families. They bind man to his responsibilities as a citizen. And from the beginning of time, art has bound man to his God. The greatest achievements of art were always sacred achievements. And even among the most primitive people, the best that they made, the best they could imagine, was brought to the temples of their deities, here offered as an expression of their own consciousness to the supreme principle which they worshipped or venerated. So artistry has been the basis of maturity. We have had quite a rise in cultural interest in the last 20 years, and I've gone over a number of catalogs and lists of various offerings in form of cultural or aesthetic cultural education. Unfortunately, we are approaching this, however, much as we approach everything else in life. You can get an excellent course in culture. You can get an excellent course in the cultural attainments of other people, but still, in most instances, it is not tied to the person. He studies art as he studies history. He studies skills as he studies industry. He does not feel the warmth of a personal relationship with the creation of beauty. He realizes perhaps it would be a splendid idea, but that is about as far as it goes in the majority of cases. Many modern educational institutions, observing the definite trend to a highly mechanized civilization, are crying out for cultural emphasis. And this is true in some of these extremely advanced brackets of modern thinking, such as electronics, physics, chemistry, biology, and similar areas. The people in these areas simply become completely oblivious of culture. As a result of it, they do not know how to hold a home together. They do not know how to be friendly with their own children. They have become gradually immersed in abstractions and profundities which give very little warmth or color or kindliness to conduct. Some of them are still fine people, but they are fine people in spite of the indoctrinations that they have received, not because of them. So we will imagine for a moment that most thoughtful people would like to do something of a creative nature. Whatever this creativity is, must be within their means, within their power, must be practical, and must give some individuality to their way of life. Unfortunately, we do not need, as we once did, so many utensils and common implements of living. And I don't think we can gain our cultural release merely by producing gadgets. We cannot simply mend broken wires or restring a lamp and announce that we have become creative geniuses. This is not the area in which we must search. Culture today to us must mean a creativity with a dedication beyond utility. Originally it was utility. In some cases it still can be. But more often it is now exactly what we must face it as being. It is a creative use of leisure for the purpose of giving ourselves a happier life. So what can we do in these areas? One thing that rather important that everyone starts this program by some effort to estimate his own creativity. What can you do? Knowing that this creativity has probably been neglected for most of a lifetime, or certainly was never highly developed, we look into ourselves and we look rather hopelessly into a vacuum. What is there that we would like to do? I've had many people with leisure time and more money than perhaps was good for them come to me with the problem of boredom. So you turn to these people and you say to them, well, what would you like to do? And that's the end of the discussion. They wouldn't like to do anything. They might like to spend a little more money. They might like to do an occasional grand shopping tour. They might like to bring in a decorator to refurnish and redecorate their homes or apartments. But when you say to these people, what would you like to do? What would you like to be? What would you like to create out of your own ingenuity? You usually get a completely blank look. Here we have a civilization better educated, better advanced probably than any other in the history of the world, and less able to actually have an original idea. So many of these people have gained security and social position by the simple process of not having ideas. If they'd had too many ideas, they'd have been economic failures, perhaps. So they have drifted along, following lines of least resistance, doing those things that other people do who get rich, And as far as personal ideas are concerned, very little. So they are bored. And we are always bored unless we create something or develop some form of dynamic self-expression. And many times I've spent an hour, 2 hours, trying to help these people to dig out of their pasts, out of their ancestry, out of their heredity, or out of their psychic integration, or lack of it, something that they wanted to do. When you get an individual who finally admits that there is nothing in the world that they want to do, your first thought, well, of course you don't say it, but your first thought is, then why are you alive? Why don't you just go off in a corner somewhere and lie down quietly and give other people a chance to do something? There is just no reason for life unless life is creative. So the first problem is to figure out what you would like to do. A clue to this sometimes is to go back into the earlier years, adolescent years, or the early years prior to marriage or just after marriage. What did you give up when you went into business? What did you give up when you married? What did you give up when you raised a family? What things that you wanted to do had to be submerged by these general responsibilities? Sometimes this gives us a little clue to work with. An individual who finally landed in the shoe business will admit that as a small boy his great ambition had been to play the piccolo. Whatever it may be, if there was something back there that was twisted out of shape by economic necessity, in which a decision was finally made that this would have been a lovely and charming way to live, but you couldn't make a living at it, so you did something else. If you have anything of this kind hidden in your psychological closet, it might supply a key to the development of a later creativity. Well, let us bear this definitely in mind, that if you are born with an interest, you will never be truly happy until that interest comes to age in you. It's well possible that you think you've forgotten it, or that you have transformed it or transmuted it into some other activity. You say to yourself, yes, when I was young I always wanted to be an artist. I wanted to paint. But after all, other things have come into my life. I have raised 5 children successfully. They're out in the world. I had no time for these things. But life always swings around. And what you wanted to do before you were 15 years old is possible and is a factor to be considered after the immediate pressures of family and other responsibilities have been lifted. The individual at 50 can get back to the things he wanted to do at 20. So if there was a pressure there, even though this pressure might seem to be unprofitable, be sure that it is still there. Be sure that in one way or another it has contributed to nervousness, to fatigue, to boredom, that it has made the life you did accept not quite as rich as it should have been, because there was something else in there that was always asking for recognition. So you say, when you reach 50 or 55 years old perhaps, that it's too late. No one can learn the piano masterfully after that age. Others will say it's too late to start a new career. Others will feel that they're too tired, too bored to begin something that might have been wonderful had they been able to achieve it in youth. All of these attitudes are simply the natural resistance of static. The individual has not done these things, he has not encouraged them, and as a result he is no longer able to handle them effectively. But if the instinct is there, let it come out again. Find it. Bring it back into objectivity in your own life. Some of your friends may think you're a little foolish, but in time you will prove to be a better friend to them because you have. Now, one thing that we do find in the business world is that the rising payments of Social Security and other benefits to the individual are beginning to emphasize that the years of later life should be rather important years. There was a time when we couldn't even look forward with certainty to a roof over our heads, when we could no longer work. Most of this condition has been alleviated, at least to some degree. And the individual finds that after 60, he does have a certain amount of leisure and a certain amount of security. However, if this leisure is not used, he is simply cheating himself out of his Social Security. For the person who has no dynamic is not going to last long enough to collect much of it. The man retires at 65 and he's dead at 67. And I have 3 cases of that within the last 2 months. The individual has not built for the dynamics of later life. Now, it is pretty hard on the day of retirement to suddenly become a tremendous creative artist. The roots of this type of self-expression have to come earlier. They have to be developed gradually as the responsibilities and pressures of other things gradually diminish. The person reaching the age of retirement should already have his cultural interests well established. He will be less of a problem to his family. He will be less demanding and critical and possessive of other people. He will be less likely to develop the irascibilities which we sometimes associate with age if he has a creative activity. He also has a much greater probability of a happy, healthy closing cycle of life. The man who died at 67, had he had proper creative outlets, would probably have been a happy citizen at 87. But he did not have anything to make life important. We have substituted an industrial economic existence for a life. When we reach the point where industry does not any longer want us, there is nothing left. And this means a gradual relaxation of the will to live, so that most older people, whether they realize it or not, commit suicide. They do it by not any longer holding on to the will to live. Life simply becomes increasingly meaningless, and this in turn results in a rise of infirmities. The person lacking creative outlets begins to develop negative attitudes. These in turn affect health and ultimately shorten life, and worse than that, burden it with years of discomfort. So if you have anything lurking in the background of your life, think about it carefully. Try to see how even in younger years you can keep this little flame just burning if you can't do very much with it. Don't let it die. Keep it in mind, keep it in heart, and realize that it can do a tremendous amount for you as time goes on. There are also many activities that are useful to younger people, particularly those that are building homes together. Here is a wonderful opportunity for creativity. Creativity that is rather meaningful today, where the high cost of setting up an establishment is rather discouraging. There are many things these young people can do themselves, do together. Work out problems that otherwise would be prohibitive to them or place them under very heavy debt. The ability to do things, to reason through simple problems. This ability is very valuable to us and is far more useful to our psychology than the problem of simply going out and buying what we want. People who actually help with their own hands to build a home together have a unity that otherwise could not be nearly as rich or valuable as human relationships. So we'll assume for the moment that somewhere you have something that would interest you. If this situation still defeats your mind, and there seems to be absolutely nothing, then what is probably indicated is a survey course on culture. In other words, the person who cannot work out this problem for himself because he simply doesn't know may either fall back upon aptitude testing to discover submerged talents, or he may develop them in another way through association. He can either take courses on the subject, or he can plan his own home study, taking up the broad survey of world artistic and aesthetic expression. If he will carefully survey his subject, read moderately of good authors, study books well illustrated with material bearing upon creative self-expression, it is quite possible that in, say, a year, or at the extreme 2 years, something that he is reading, something that he sees, something that comes to his attention through the general study of culture will strike a note within himself. He will suddenly say, well, now there's something I would enjoy doing. This, of course, is the lead. And when this point has been reached, the subject begins to take proportions and make sense. Whatever be the way we arrive at it, we should never really cease seeking for this type of self-expression. We should consider it just as important in our maturing as any academic philosophy or even any religious idealism. Because actually religion without art is losing most of its value to us. Religion that does not touch a maturing cultural core within our natures is defeated in its effort to reach into our lives and make us better and happier people. So even in the most formal search for truth, in the most esoteric and mystical interpretation of religion, the cultivation of beauty and the cultivation of fineness are very, very essential. Not long ago, I was discussing some of this type of problem with an Oriental art dealer whom I know. He made a series of rather interesting observations. He goes to Japan and Hong Kong every year in the cause of buying for his store. And he brings back all kinds of interesting merchandise. I've gone to him many times and I've asked him what he had of interest religiously. So, for instance, in the Oriental religions, Buddhism or Taoism or Confucianism, what kind of religious art did he buy? He said, frankly, he didn't buy any. The reason being that in the United States there's practically no demand for it. When he said no demand, he modified it, of course. He said there are small groups of collectors, but the dealer would go broke trying to wait for them. That actually we are neglecting one of the most interesting aspects of Oriental culture, namely their religious art. Probably partly due to prejudice against it, partly due to lack of understanding of its meaning. Now, this type of art demands a certain amount of thoughtfulness from the purchaser, or he is not happy with the thing he buys. So serious material along the lines of Oriental art is still available. And whereas secular art is becoming prohibitive, religious art and folk art are still neglected. So it is still possible for very excellent collections of this material to be made at reasonable prices. This type of thinking also applies in our own culture. We have not found in America any true school of religious art. About the nearest thing we have are some very good stained glass window artists. These, however, are mostly of foreign extraction. We have no great art of our own to ornament our churches or ornament our sacred edifices. What we have is mostly of European background, or in the modern trend of today, art being almost unavailable is simply ignored. And the average religious institution has little, if any, good art in it. This type of situation does gravitate against the spiritual integrity of the person. It makes it less possible for him to enter into a certain devotional attitude, because great religious art, like the Oriental mandala, is a concentration or meditation center. It is something that enables the person to feel a greater proximity to the spiritual truths of life. So do not consider art or culture as apart from religion and philosophy. It is an essential element in them. We remember that Socrates was a sculptor. We know that nearly all of the great philosophers of the past were also artisans of some kind, that they were, many of them, great creative artists. This was part of their indoctrination, for once wisdom came into their minds, they found it increasingly difficult to live without beauty. So we'll imagine that in some way or other you do come to some sense of an internal potential. Now, one of the most simple fields of self-expression or creative expression for persons who are unskilled as artisans is in the field of literature. Our literary output at the present time is the poorest in the history of civilized man. We are producing magnificent technical volumes. In this area, we are very, very progressive. But in terms of fine literature, we are producing almost nothing. We are selling books almost entirely upon the basis of emotional appeal, which is not particularly constructive and far from aesthetic. So here we have a great need of supplying better kinds of literature. Back in the 17th century, they already had printing, but there were a great many people, such as the mystics and the alchemists and persons of this nature, who could not find the books that they wanted. They found no publishers for them if they had the manuscripts available. So what did these resourceful people do? They restored the ancient art of hand illumination, and they did their own books. These books now are priceless, because they represent the rebellion of a group of thoughtful persons against the limitations imposed upon the printing of their time. Also, perhaps the demand for these books was not great enough to justify large editions, but they were circulated privately. And of course, nearly all of the illuminated chemical, hermetic, and philosophical Rosicrucian manuscripts of the 17th and 18th century were produced as what we would call folk artistry. The men who illuminated these works had never studied art. They had studied chemistry. Yet many of them were astonishingly skillful, and some extremely beautiful works were produced around philosophic themes and circulated privately among friends. Others in turn copied these as their needs arose, and one manuscript passing along through 100 years of ownerships was copied a dozen times. And these copies are also extremely interesting and very valuable, showing different degrees of artistry, but a tremendous determination to get hold of that material, to get the text and keep it. So today we have this possibility rising that there could be a restoration of fine arts in literature, poetry, which may be difficult to publish, especially if it is an inspirational type of poetry, can still be written, can still be prepared, can still be circulated among those appreciating such artistry, and many wonderful things can be done. Also, there is a great need for the type of inspirational literature that arises from great sincerity and is not subject to the requirements of the always autocratic publisher. And many times, the book that was never intended for publication is the one that does find print, for the reason that so many people write for publication and therefore compromise their own convictions. So in writing of poetries, essays, even fiction, fine literary works, the individual who has had an interesting or dramatic or unusual life can find a wonderful outlet, whether what he does ever is printed or not. This is not important. It is important that he creates. It is important also that perhaps he makes, either through mimeographing or through carbon copies, a number of copies available for those of similar tastes and interests. In China, in the Middle Ages, in many countries, including ancient Greece, and among the Romans also, groups were established just for this purpose. A dozen or 20 who loved poetry got together and formed a poetic reading circle. They read good poetry by other people, but most of all, they created poetry for themselves. They created new things which they read in these circles of poets. Some of these collections were afterwards printed and have become among the greatest examples of poetic literature. Thus, there are areas here in which something interesting can be done. One of the interesting habits the Japanese developed in connection with their poetry circles was the art of the surumono. The surumono was a small decorative picture, usually associated symbolically or mystically with a short poem. Here is a very interesting, genteel occupation for today. Have you ever thought of illustrating a line of a poem? Have you ever thought of making a picture that only takes one tiny line, and perhaps then only by association, in which you don't actually draw a picture of the line itself or of the exact meaning of it, but you extend over into some symbolic area, allowing your own consciousness to illustrate this little poem? One simple thing to do is to take a piece of good drawing paper, does not need to be large or expensive, and up in the upper left-hand corner of that, write the verse of the poem, and then allow your own heart to trace something that this poem suggests in your own consciousness. It should be what the poem suggests to you, and not merely the line itself. Thousands of these magnificent artworks, some of them priceless, were produced simply by people who liked to share these concepts with their friends and formed these circles that met once a month or once every 2 weeks or sometimes only once a year. But they all came with something that they had produced that they cherished. And they brought to this artistry no self-consciousness, no jealousy because somebody else's poem was a little better. The question was not, I wish I had written the other man's poem. The answer to this was, I'm so glad that he did a better poem. This type of real sincerity gives also a very interesting creativity and offers an opportunity for a great deal of artistry and artistic consideration. Suppose also that you find when you attempt to do this that your color instinct is not very mature, that your line wavers a little, that you're not quite sure that you can draw anything very skillfully. This suggests perhaps a little more technical knowledge, a few lessons, a little reading in a good art book, something to help you, but no longer merely for the sake of learning to draw, but rather learning to express a conviction through drawing. So art and poetry and literature work together in an astonishing way. And one of the ancient systems in Greece had an interesting theory on this. When the time came for a disciple of one of the great schools to graduate, he had to produce the equivalent of what we would call today a thesis. He had to prepare with his own hands a book or statement of his purposes, of his ideas, of what the instruction he had received meant to him as a living person. Many times these works were illuminated. The student, instead of making 3 neat typewritten copies, did this work as William Blake did his books, by hand. He actually drew the symbols and pictures and artistry that were the results of his inspiration. And these were turned over to the master of the school, and the master passed upon them and returned the work, which then became a kind of sacred volume, perpetuated through the school or through the departments that this younger disciple created for himself. This type of creativity also is wonderful in connection with study. If you have certain ideas about philosophy or comparative religion, if you can make pictures of these ideas, if you can unfold sequences of designs that are appropriate to them, you have a new dimensional control of your subject matter. And here is a field that can be entered for the moderate expenditure of probably $1 or $1.50. It does not become necessary to have an air-conditioned studio with a north light to do this. It can be done in an apartment, in a single room. It can be done almost anywhere. But it does represent not an elaborate setup, but a deep purpose that is to be developed in some way. Now, if your artistic creativity does not run in this direction, perhaps it will run in music. Music is a very interesting field. Music perhaps comes as close to the laws of creativity as art does, because all these media, these tremendous cultural forces, are nothing but universal law made manifest. The musician is working with the harmonic principles of law just as the colorist is, or just as the poet does with meter. Every one of these represents a function of universal reality. To become aware of such function and to use such function in some creative way yourself is of the greatest importance and helps to enrich life and take away from us so much of the pressure of monotony and boredom. The individual also just hasn't time to worry. He hasn't time to nurture his dislikes and his prejudices and his opinions. He is now validly occupied in doing something which he believes will be valuable to himself and others. So in music we have a wonderful power, not only to develop our own tastes, but also to confer pleasure and music appreciation upon other people. So in music sometimes we find a wonderful field. Now music does not necessarily imply that the individual has to be a performer, because music presents to us a number of other very highly specialized fields. Many of the world's greatest musicologists have not been skillful musicians themselves, but they have had tremendous music understanding in their hearts. The entire theory of music understanding, music culture, opens a world of principles, of laws, which are of tremendous value to us. Naturally, most persons deeply concerned will try in some way to transform their love of music into some measure of artistry. But it can be quite modest. It does not have to be extravagant or unusual.
It can simply be merely a means of expressing the tremendous dynamic of music understanding. Music is a very warm kind of understanding, and will do a great deal to enrich the lives of those who become concerned with it. Now, there are some people who find these more or less contemplative avocations not quite suitable to them. There are many who feel that the one thing that gives them the greatest satisfaction is to do something with their hands. This is especially true, I think, today, where so many people are suffering from a degree of brain fag. They have done maybe more thinking along some field than they really wanted to do. Perhaps the thinking has not been as creative as it should be, but they do feel the need of escaping from sedentary activities into a dynamic of some kind. For these people, activity itself is, of course, a very important phase of culture. The skillful hand is the name that the ancient peoples of Central America gave to one of their deities. And the skillful hand is the hand that creates. It is the hand that has dropped the sword and has taken instead the brush, the mallet, or the chisel. So in some form of physical creativity, the individual has the most simple and obvious example of making things, of doing things. Now, this may or may not require a little more equipment. One of the most interesting American Indians I have ever known did a world of extraordinary carvings, beautiful things, with only one instrument, a penknife that he had exchanged once for a sheepskin. This penknife was his most trusted possession. This Indian plus his penknife equaled art. With this penknife he had not only created interesting and remarkable things, but he woke one morning and found himself famous. He not only was then able to make these things, but he was able to dispose of them as rapidly as he made them, and from that time on the quality of the product began to deteriorate. He was no longer making them for his own pleasure. But even in our economic pressure, people do find occasionally that additional income from hobbies is valuable to them. But you don't have to have a lot of equipment or a lot of space or a lot of money to do any of these things. But you can develop various types of creative expression. I don't know how many modern people today know about the Peruvian finger weaving. This is used not only in Peru, but in a number of European countries, where various weavings are done entirely without a loom, entirely with the fingers. This type of weaving, of course, has limitations. The fabrics are of no size, that is, not great size, but they are suitable for belts and things of that nature. But the individual has no equipment but his own hands, yet he is able to create. So if there is a limit of facility, this does not necessarily deprive the person of cultural interest. It merely demands greater ingenuity on his own part. There are also various lines of special cultural activity that we find rising around in our Western life today, such as, for example, the flower arrangements which have come to us from Asia, or the preparation of miniature table gardens, which can be a very intriguing and very interesting thing. I know areas in which these gardens are entered in competitive performance and prizes awarded. And the individual who wins a prize for the beauty of his table garden probably feels even better than the individual who gets a special dividend on his stock, because the dividend just doesn't give him that sense of personal achievement. Not long ago, here in Los Angeles, I attended an exhibition of bonsai trees, dwarf trees, that were made here although imported here at various times. It was a marvelous exhibition. I remember one example in which a large clay dish, probably 3 feet in length, oval, about a foot wide, the widest area, had been so beautifully arranged that from this rose a complete forest of miniature trees. No tree was more than 12 or 15 inches high, but there were certainly 20 or 30 of them, in a magnificent grouping, and each one a perfect miniature of a great forest tree. Now this, of course, represents a degree of labor that the average person probably is not equipped for in our ordinary Western way of life. A number of these trees were little tags telling their age, and some of them had been under perpetual and continuous care, and that's a very exacting care, for over 200 years. But it was an example of pure aesthetics, labor for the love of labor, no rewards, simply the privilege, the wonder of achieving through self-discipline a magnificent effect, a quality that was really almost unbelievable. Yet many of the greatest of the bonsai trees originated as natural trees. In other words, the tree was not cultivated from the beginning. It was first found and then gradually conditioned. This means that in mountainous areas, in rural districts, in many places, trees of this nature, small ones, just starting, on some rough or broken bit of rock, have already by nature been twisted into the primary shapes used in bonsai. As a result, these trees can be transplanted, and the individual already has 10, 20, 30 years of work done for him. He then arranges according to his own taste, watching and controlling and directing until actually the tree becomes merely a mirror reflecting his own sense of value. It becomes his own realization of proportion and harmony made manifest through this little tree. If all other elements of creativity seem to be comparatively lacking, there is always the sand garden. Now, the sand garden is simply an area. It can be 20, 30 feet square if we have a lot of land, or it can be on the table also in a bowl. A sand garden is the process of creating art by merely two elements, sand and small pieces of rock. One exhibition I saw of sand gardens included an exceptionally fine one, in which a rock had been found about 10 or 12 inches high, quite rough in proportion and shape, in which considerable amount of iron oxide was on the rock, which had been stained by this to a kind of an orange color. This piece of rock was placed in the midst of sand, and then, having been perfectly proportioned to the sand itself carefully rippled by fine rakes until it had a movement in itself, and then the label was placed on it, sunset on a rock. And the peculiar orange shading in the rock created the perfect illusion of the last rays of the sun striking that stone. This was something that was done very quietly, and I'm quite certain that the individual who did that not only had a wonderful sense of internal serenity from putting this pattern together, but achieved some kind of a personal victory. And the victory was evident in that person, because when you knew that person, you found a lovely, gracious, beautifully integrated person. A person who had found in the love of art a wonderful enrichment of spirit. So all kinds of odd and unusual things can be done that simply demands patience, thoughtfulness. I will never know how many hours the person sat in front of that rock in that little sand bowl, working those elements together until the proportion was correct. But in doing this person had learned something. They had a tremendous lesson in proportion. Their whole concept of universal dynamics was there. The only reason that little arrangement was beautiful was because it was mathematically and scientifically sound. It had to be right, and there was only one rightness possible. One man once asked Michelangelo, he said, "How do you know when you make a drawing that your figures are in the right place?" The artist thought for a little moment, and then he said, "Well, I guess the answer is that there is only one right place. And when you put them there, you suddenly know it." And this is art. This is creativity. There's only one right way to live. There's only one right way to treat other people. When we do it, we know it. And in art, we begin to experience the mysteries of these right ways of doing things. We discover that there is inside of ourselves something that knows the right way the moment we show it. The moment we put that rock where it belongs, something inside says, "That's it, leave it alone." And it is this something inside that we are all desperately seeking to release, because it is this inside thing that is health, is happiness, is growth, is spiritual adjustment for us. And through some form of creativity, we have to release it into manifestation. Where you can go from any particular point in connection with this type of artistry, it is hard to say. An individual could start with a bonsai tree and end as a great expert on Asiatic arts. Another individual could begin with some small fabric of weaving, and then by knowing all of the great creative textile crafts of mankind. These things go on, but they are also forever telling us laws and principles. I don't know how many individuals have ever really thought anything about the ancient dyes that were used in painting, pigmentation, weaving, textiles, house ornamentation, all of the ancient dyes that were in use before the development of aniline and chemical dyes. There's no way in which the ancient dyes can be imitated. They represented elements taken from nature, from minerals, and from vegetables. These dyes never clashed. It was almost impossible to make an inharmonious combination. These dyes are what the Japanese would call strictly shibui. Each one of them is a perfect color. Each one of them is part of a great natural palette. They were not created in a chemical process, or were they derived from the innumerable byproducts of coal tar. They were living color, the color of desert and mountain, the color of trees against the sky. These colors were great archetypal tones. And in working with them, man discovers color harmony as he cannot in any other way. And to understand these arts is to restore a comparatively lost art. Yet today, all over the world, craftsmen are trying to put together the story of ancient color. They are trying to find out what happened to us psychologically when the aniline dye took over. Something happened to our sense of beauty. Something happened to our peace of soul, because suddenly we were surrounding ourselves with colors that were not valid in nature. And while we didn't know it consciously, something subconscious in ourselves was not happy about the procedure in any way. We also realize that there are marvelous crafts developing around minor artistries, such as restoration of the ancient ideas of jewelry making, restoration of enamels and inlays. All of these things are possible home activities. Then we can go into other types of things. We can go into creativity in woodwork, in various devices. We can build furniture if we want to. We can do marvelous weavings and embroideries. And by the way, I wonder how many people really remember the fact that nearly all the great weaving and most of the great embroidery of the world was done by men. This has gradually come to be regarded as a feminine interest. And when we found that the old king of Sweden loved to knit, everybody smiled a little about it. But at the same time, some of the world's finest fabrics and tapestries have been made by men. So the man also, perhaps even more than the woman, needs this type of outlet. Yet today he would regard himself as utterly embarrassed if he was caught engaged in it. Yet if he needs it, he needs it. And working with beautiful color and fine material is very needed by the average man whose life has become utterly commonplace. So whatever these arts and crafts are, do not worry about this. Whether you have decided that you would like to study marine life and put an aquarium in your home, or something of this nature. I know one individual who got a whole group of miniature fish, and got a home aquarium. He had some 5 beta splendens and some wonderful old stellaries. I can tell them by name. I had them too. This particular situation, however, led to something else. He began to make miniature models of these little creatures, and he finally made them in glass. And he developed some of the most magnificent forms and structures conceivable, and became quite famous, like the individual who became world famous and to whom a whole gallery has been given in one of our greatest museums, simply because of his magnificent miniature models of various flowers, plants, and seeds. These things, you never know which way your ingenuity is going to go, but there is something for everyone to express creativity. And I haven't mentioned or discussed these things in which you can go and watch somebody else do it, and I didn't do that on purpose. I would like to think that more people will be interested in doing things. Now, one of the things you may have to do in order to learn to do things is, of course, to study what other people have done. But out of this love of art, out of this love of assembling fine things, there should always come the instinct to do something yourself, to make sure that the world's tradition of beauty goes on. In the world today, there are plenty of people who want to make sure that the world's tradition of death goes on. They want to, or are, whether they want to or not, contributing to the survival of pain, misery, suffering, and destruction. If these people laboring incessantly at their crafts continue and no one takes on any creative activity, our world is going to become not only very dull, but possibly very extinct. There is tremendous need to bring creativity back into the lives of private citizens. And it's hard to imagine that any group in which this would be more suitable than to persons who are seriously studying philosophy and religion and matters of this kind, who are looking for higher levels of education and attainment, and who would like to make some kind of a positive contribution to the culture of their world. These are the very people to whom this message should have the greatest and most immediate meaning. Therefore, we strongly recognize this need, and we hope that each one of you will give it some thought and see whether there isn't some way in which you can bring joy to your own soul and happiness to your friends by developing creative instincts and applying them within the area of your own abilities to something which brings beauty out of the soul and into the world and into the life of the individual. I think you will all find it a helpful and rewarding experience. Thank you very kindly, but the time is up.